And the honor to close Serbia Next Stage goes to Dragan Kovačević. Dragan is a senior product owner at TradeCore, and join him in improving design decisions with Agile. And now, please welcome the Justice League of Agile, host Petri Heiramo, and his panelists Almudena Rodriguez Pardo, Karl Scotland, and who else but my man, Bob Hartman, Agile Bob, for the panel discussion, What Shall We Do with Managers in an Agile Organization?
Welcome. Does this come through? Yes, it does. Wonderful. So, welcome to the panel conversation. My name is Petri Heiramo. I will be moderating some of the conversation. And Bob, Karl, and Almudena, would you quickly introduce yourselves to those of you who may not yet have seen you on stage?
Hi everybody, so I'm Karl Scotland, I'm from the UK, live down in Brighton on the south coast, and I'm an independent lean and agile consultant, so I go around helping organisations on their agile journeys.
Hello, my name is Almudena Rodriguez Pardo, don't try to speak it up. I come from Spain. Originally, I live in Germany where I have my headquarters. I am business agility consultant for the company Improvement 21.
And I'm Bob Hartman, and my company is Agile for All. And we try to help companies transform from top to bottom and be more agile along the way.
Thank you. So I'll start with a question that came through the Q&A section from the audience. So in Agile organization, coming through, right? Okay. In Agile organizations, teams are supposed to be self-organizing, right? So what's the role of a manager in an Agile organization?
I'll go first as I'm nearest. For me, the role of the Agile is even more important because we have self-organizing teams. So if we don't have managers and we have self-organizing teams, the risk is that those teams self-organize themselves in multiple different directions. So how do we have multiple teams that are aligned and self-organizing with the same intent and moving in the same direction? And who decides what that direction is going to be? So for me, that's the role of a manager, is to have clarity, intent, and provide leadership so that when the teams do self-organize, they're self-organizing in the right way.
Okay. Anyone?
Go ahead. I completely agree. I see it very similar. I mean, if we consider that at the very beginning, Google tried to work without managers. So they said, you know, we're a modern company, we're young, we don't need managers. And they failed. They realized they do need some managers. And they have a very interesting study called the Project Oxygen, where they analyzed the big data they had to see what does it make up a good manager. And that was very interesting that what it was found was more or less what you were mentioning. They were the people who are good communicators and just give the frame, define the direction.
I think managers are there to help us set up for success and help us have a vision for success, and not necessarily do what managers have done in the past, where they try to direct us towards success. So I think their role is still necessary, but what they do has to change significantly in setting up environments where teams can be successful and defending those teams and protecting those teams and doing things that they're not normally doing. So rather than pressuring them, let's have a common goal and vision, and let's all strive for that. I think that's still the role of a manager.
Yeah, I think one way of thinking about that is, I guess the traditional view is the managers manage the people. In an agile organization, the managers manage the system. Yep. So you're creating the right environment, you're setting direction so that people can self-organize.
So why don't, most frameworks talk about the manager then, if it's an important role? Scrum is silent on it. Scrum is silent on manager role. Many other frameworks don't mention it either. So why so? Why is that?
That's a very good question. I don't know. I think they should.
I think part of it is that scaling agility has been tried to be scaling the structure and the frame and the practices, and not necessarily scaling the right things. If I'm scaling structure and practices, I will continue to get the same results I've gotten, just at a larger scale. And that may or may not be what we're looking for. I think that when we start talking about changing the role of manager to be more effective, that gets harder to put on a picture. How does that role change? And how does it do what it's supposed to do now? So I think it becomes a little harder to describe, and therefore they tend to shy away from that. Part of it may be marketing, part of it may be reality, I don't know, but I always start with, when I'm dealing with companies, how does the leadership group need to change to enable agility to scale?
I wonder whether it's partly from the roots of Agile. So the early Agile teams and the early Scrum teams and extreme programming teams, it was a single small team just trying to get better at delivering an internal software project or a software project. And at that point, at that small scale, yeah, maybe you don't need managers. As we start doing this at scale across larger organizations, the need for alignment, the need for common strategy and those things becomes a lot more important. So there's probably historical reasons. And then, you can look at Scaled Agile Framework. It does talk about managers, so there is at least a recognition in there that this role is important, and we do need some of that guidance.
Yeah, when we're teaching my company the SAFE courses, you always get to the point where some manager asks, where's my role? Like I cannot find myself here. I says, right, you have to reinvent yourself. I mean, what do you think will be your role here? And then we start a discussion. So I think it's about management reinventing themselves in this scale, different frameworks of scaling. So they surely have position, but they have to find it again. And that's for them a challenge.
So where should the managers look for guidance then? Any frameworks they could look into and up to, and for advice how to be an Agile manager? Know anything?
So my approach to this is to look to the Lean kind of body of knowledge, and Lean has the notion of strategy deployment. So I kind of mentioned it in my talk, and it's what I spend a lot of time doing now, working with organizations where working with the senior leadership in the organization to be very clear about strategic intent. And then there are frameworks and ways of working where we can then deploy that strategic intent and work with the people in the organization using A3 thinking and some of those tools and techniques to help people learn how to realize that strategic intent. So there's the idea that the manager doesn't necessarily have all the right answers. So we're not expecting managers to know the solutions, know the answers, and just tell people what to do and manage people in doing that. But by setting direction, we then recognize that the people closest to the problem, the people doing the work, probably have the most information and the most knowledge and the best skills to figure out how to solve the problems. So there's some frameworks and some ideas in the Lean community that help with that.
So Lean would be one place. Any other ones that you would possibly direct people to?
I always use the 8 organizational shifts that I mentioned in the talk this morning. How do we go from the talk about efficiency to experimentation? How do we go from predicting and controlling to enabling experiments? How do we shift from heroic leadership to transformational leadership? Those are the things we have to think about, and they're based on solid principles versus scaling structures and practices, which generally means you're going to have some change in the structure and in the practices in order to better live those principles and become more agile. I think part of the reason scaling frameworks don't talk about managers in general is because they're not part of a Scrum team. And so if I'm scaling Scrum, manager isn't there today, I have to insert that role, and I have to do it in a meaningful way, and that's difficult to use the same manager word when really the word should be more along enabler or champion or some other word that says we're not directing people, we're enabling them to be successful.
I think there's another area that can be looked into, which is potentially an unusual and a surprising one, which is the military. So the military gets a bad rap with, we talk about command and control. Actually, that done well is the leadership, management, providing the command, but they're not taking control. They're giving control to the people to figure out how to implement those commands. So there's a couple of really good books that I would recommend on this. One is The Art of Action by Stephen Bungay, who talks about the history of the military and mission command, and where that came from with Helmut von Moltke in the 19th century. So the Prussian army figured this out well over 100 years ago, and we're still catching up. And the other more recent one is Turn the Ship Around by David Marquet, which is a fascinating story about the way he took over as commander of a US nuclear submarine, which was one of the worst performing in the fleet, and turned it around to be the best performing by just having clarity of intent. He didn't tell the crew what to do. He told the crew what he would like them to achieve, what outcomes, and he trained and he gave the crew kind of permission and autonomy to take their own action. So I think those are two kind of really good ways of looking at potentially the way we would want the role of manager in an agile organization to be.
That sounds eerily similar than the Bill of Rights that was mentioned in the keynote today, sort of that approach. But there are some organizations, come to think of it, Valve and Morningstar, that are, famous for not having any managers in them. So how do they do that?
Well, they don't have someone called a manager, but they still have all of those skills and things that a manager would do. They're simply being done by the team members who are self-organizing. So they took the role of manager and distributed it among the team, which is another way to do it. You wouldn't go into a company that has many managers and say, by the way, we're going to fire you all and we're going to give it to the team. That wouldn't go over very well. So they had the ability to do that because of the way that they grew, but most organizations can't do that. And by the way, we do the same thing in Scrum, right? The role of project manager isn't really a Scrum role. Ken Schwaber is very clear that he took that role and distributed it among all three of the roles in Scrum. Does it mean we don't have project managers anymore? No, it means they do something that's different than what they did before. And I think manager in general is the same sort of idea.
I think it has to do, I actually like these examples a lot. They are all put together in this book, Reorganizing or Reinventing Organizations from Lalux. He has put a lot of examples of companies running in this teal concept without management. After working for so many years in the telecommunications sector for big enterprise with a lot of legacy, I think it's also a factor where are we coming from before we head in that direction. So of course I would love to have all companies working like Morningstar, but you have to consider the existing culture of the company and the legacy. How quick can you go and let the manager nurture another mentality and develop another skills? So it also takes time. There are companies who can do it like this. I love it, for example, when I talk at university to students, it's fantastic because they have no legacy. They've never worked in a waterfall system. Whatever you tell them, they love it. And it's a different situation if you go with a company who's been many years in the market and you try to change the things and the way management was working. So I think we have to consider this when we talk about examples like Tomato Star.
You've seen people in different managerial roles in organizations. Do you have any inspiring stories that you could share about some maybe personal transformations like the one that you shared in the morning, or some just brilliant example of what does that role mean or that kind of person look like?
So I have another story from Whole Foods, pretty famous company in the United States, they organic stuff. And they're one of our clients, but not the markets, the financial services group of Whole Foods. And we started working with them about 6 years ago. And the first day that I did a class there was a woman by the name of Dallas Hinesley, who was a business analyst at the time and felt like she was failing at work. She was a single 26-year-old mom, failing at home. Her and her kid didn't get along. Her wife was falling apart. And the group said, hey, we need to have a Scrum Master. And she said, I'm terrible as a BA, how about I try that job? And it turned out that she was a natural leader, that while not a manager yet, she grew through that role to understand what managers need to do to be successful And I'm not talking about directing people, I'm talking about influencing them and being a good leader, to the point where 6 years later, she is now the enterprise coach for Whole Foods and is coaching other people how to enable groups to be successful in a very difficult environment. And so they really want to learn how to help others help themselves, and that has kind of become their motto. And so she has a really good story there. She was promoted in 6 years. I think she was promoted 12 times. She teaches Scrum and Agile to battered women's shelters so people can take on personal Kanban, personal Scrum, to make a difference in their home lives. And I think that's the kind of thing that we can all kind of aspire to do someday, is impact people who are less fortunate than ourselves. And I look to her as a great example, as somebody who's making a difference in the world, both inside and outside of work.
I had personal experience when we introduced Scrum, getting old, I think 8 years ago in the department in Ericsson. I was in part of one Scrum team. And of course, everything was very confusing. We had been doing waterfall for such a long time. And now come this Scrum, and we had some pilots, so the first Scrum teams, of course, we're running against the wall, so many dependencies, so many factors around which were not agile, and all these problems with brand new Scrum teams in the company have when they start working in an agile way. And the department manager at that point, he came up to us in the open office, he looked at us and said, guys, what do you need from me? What can I do for you? No, of course, we started, we need this, and we need that, and we need that, and we have so many escalations. Nobody listened to us, and it's everything terrible. And he said, okay. And he actually got another manager to sit with us in the middle. So he said, you sit here, and you're close to this guy, and whatever escalation or problem they have, you take over and you move it. So whenever we had the problem, we said, escalation, and this manager got up and said, what can I do for you? So they were so supportive. And they were new to Scrum as we were, and they were not understanding everything, but they did, from my point of view, the best thing you can do. Say, guys, what do you need? How can we help you? To the Scrum teams. And I found that was a really an excellent servant attitude.
So if I think back, kind of trying to think of which stories to tell, but maybe the one that's springing to mind most is when I was working for Rally Software. So before Rally got bought by CA, and the culture of that organisation was an amazing, it was an amazing place to work, and that was really inspired and I guess led by the leadership team and the CTO and the CEO, and so some examples of some of the things that used to go on there was one of the, I guess the principles was it was really about making the most of the people that were working there. So if you wanted to change role and move to a different piece of the organisation because you wanted to learn more and grow more, that was totally fine. So there's certainly one of my former colleagues, who actually I kind of still keep in touch with. I think he almost worked in every bit of the organisation. So he at one point he was agile coaching, he did some product management, he worked in the office of the CTO. I think he worked with the development organisation. So he really kind of moved around the organisation, because the organisation didn't want to lose him. So it was really, valuing people and wanting to make the most of people. And, my own experience there was, kind of starting off in the UK. I started working with the office of the CTO as well. And it was real, just open, sharing, valuing people, trying things out as well. So it was really it was okay to try things out. The transparency there was amazing. And that was, for me, that was all led and driven by the senior management team, really.
Now, here's a question from the audience that came today. How much do you see that the manager role overlaps with product owner or scrum master? In what way, if it does?
So I think they're different. So to me, so scrum master, product owner are more roles. And maybe management is a role as well, but with different focuses. I guess at the end of the day, you're looking for leadership in a particular area, and certain decision making and guidance. Potentially Scrum Master, Product Owner are more product related, working with specific teams, and maybe we think of more managers being more organizational level.
Really depends on the culture of the company and on the manager itself. I've seen stand-ups where the wording was changed when a manager joined. Automatically people started talking in a different way. So it does influence the culture of Scrum if this manager, for example, happens to be the person who decides about your salary increase, not to put an example. So it really depends on which culture we have of transparency of salaries, of setting bonus. Mostly, it's my personal experience so far, I recommend to keep a safe environment for the Scrum teams. So any management role, to keep it out of it. That's my experience so far. As long as this person is the one who might influence the career of this other person, you mostly notice the way they talk in the stand-up changes.
Yeah, so I've seen teams where the Scrum Master is also the manager of the team, like the line manager, and making decisions around pay, and that doesn't usually end well. I think it can. I think if you're clear around separating these things out, but it's hard.
Yeah.
I don't like the word manager in general, because I don't think it really is a manager anymore. I think when we talk about manage, we're talking about being very directive. And in Scrum, that's not what any of those roles do. They self-organize to achieve a goal. And so saying that someone directs them in a particular fashion, they're very disjointed for me, so I don't see the connection there. And I think when they are connected, we end up with situations where they can't self-organize because their manager is part of that group. And so they're automatically not self-organizing, they're led. And when they're led, we go back to the old way of work.
I think that goes back to the idea of managing the system versus managing the people. And if you're trying to do both,
it's hard.
Well, by managing the people, you are still managing the system, but you're managing the system in probably a slightly dysfunctional way. So I could imagine it being okay if the Scrum Master was the manager, where the manager recognized that their role as Scrum Master was to create the right system and in the right environment, and therefore not to kind of tie pay rises to performance reviews and things like that, because that's the system. That's how, and people will behave however they're measured and however they're incentivized to.
And I agree, Karl. I think managing the system is different than managing people. But I think when people hear the word manager, they hear people part of that, and so that's what makes me concerned is when we equate those two.
It's the traditional view. Yeah.
What about product owner? So you talked about Scrum Master, maybe sometimes in special circumstances being able to manage. What about product owner? They do have, if we don't want to say the word authority, but they do provide leadership in certain dimensions and define the content of work. Could you imagine that a manager could be a product owner, or the product owner could be also the manager?
Well, the product owner has some management skills that they need. They need to manage the system around how we're going to create a backlog and have it be effective, but they're not managing people, same as any of the other roles in Scrum. When you're trying to mix the two, as Karl said, when you're trying to manage the system and manage the people, you have to make some interesting choices, and the people you're managing have to make some interesting choices. Most of the time, that doesn't end well.
Yeah, I was also thinking of the variety of the role, like a product owner as one person, it mostly doesn't cover all the knowledge you need. So Jeff Patton speaks of the triad, about 3 people covering this role with the architectural knowledge, the business knowledge, and the UX experience. That was the proposal of Jeff Patton, and actually I bring it very much in the companies I coach. So I try to keep away from one single person doing the product owner job, because I think there's not one person who knows the complete priority setting. Now, if we have a triad, or we have an architect supporting some UX experience, and one of these persons is a manager, when it comes to setting priorities, you might not be able to keep the balance. So that is, there has to be a very healthy discussion on how do we set the priorities between the different business values we might bring into the backlog. And in one sprint, it might be some technical issues which have to be fixed. In the next one might be some product for the customer. And I don't think it helps if some person in this group of product owner support has a management role and has some sort of more power decision.
I think when product owners manage people, there's a tension that shouldn't be there. We're in sprint planning, the team says that's what we can do, and the product owner very legitimately could ask them, are you sure you can't do more? Would be a legitimate question. But if you're also my manager, there's an implication behind that of, I'm expecting you to do more, therefore you're in trouble if you don't, and now all kinds of bad effects come into play.
Have you seen any cases where a team member, like a team lead being kind of a manager superior to the other teams, to actually work? Or is it just a no-no? So, I mean, if you have a team, not the product owner, not the scrum master, but a team where one of the people is like a team lead or, has a supervisory senior relationship to the team members, have you seen any situation where that could work?
So one of my clients is the U.S. Air Force, very hierarchical organization. And when they're doing meetings, they have a sign on the wall, and it says ranks and no ranks. And all of their Scrum meetings are considered no ranks meetings. In other words, no one has a rank in that meeting. We are all equal. And if there's a need to do something where we have ranks, then we can change the sign and make it clear, now I'm talking as your commanding officer. And they have a rule where Scrum meetings should be no ranks, and any meeting with the client should have ranks, because the meeting with the client needs to know that we're following the Air Force hierarchy, the person in charge knows what they're doing, etc. So I have seen situations like that where when they can say literally no ranks and everybody buys in that that's the situation, then it can be very successful.
So, but it requires deep trust in that new defined state.
And it requires an expectation that it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and making it explicit, I think, and as when and when not.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I've seen teams where there's been a team lead, and the team lead has a team under him, and they're all one team, and I've seen that work well, where the team lead, it's a team lead, I suppose arguably from a hierarchical point of view, they're a manager, but really the way they do the role is, I'm a team lead because I'm here to develop the team. So it's about growing the people again and investing the people and seeing cross-training with people or kind of seeing where people need help and giving them that help rather than that, telling them what to do management. So I think, what's interesting, I think, in some of these discussions is we're kind of assuming that a certain style of management, and I think a lot of their answers we're giving is probably saying, well, that's not necessarily the only way of doing management. Management is more managing the system and growing the people.
Okay, let's say that there is a more traditional manager in a more traditional organization, and they would not want to become an agile manager. What could they do without getting killed in that organization and person? Any advice that you give to those people? What could they do?
So they don't want to change.
No, the person would want to change, but they're still in the same more traditional organization, and they don't like that anymore, and they would want to do something. What could be done? Things that could be done without getting killed by the ecosystem.
So I think at any level in the organization, you have, unless you're at the very top, you would have been given goals by your manager. So really, then and then you've got your teams and your people around you. I think what I'd be looking to do is make sure I understand what my goals are, and having conversations with my manager to make sure I understand what their goals are and how I'm helping my manager meet his goals. And then I'm working with my team to say, how can you help me meet my goals? Now, I'm not telling them how to meet my goals. I'm saying, here's my goals, here's my intent, so strategic intent, coming back to that. What things can we do to help us all meet our strategic intent? So I think you can do that within a bit of a bubble. And you're not doing it in complete isolation because you're still wanting to be communicating up. Because ultimately, your manager really shouldn't care. As long as you're helping him meet his goals, he'll be happy. Now, if he's not meeting his goals, he's going to be coming down and kind of going, right, what's going on? Who's doing this? Right, you do that. So this kind of, you need to manage that, I think.
I think you said traditional manager that wants to stay a traditional manager, and I don't think there's a way for that to work out very well. I think they need to change in some cases, in almost all cases, and I like the book that Karl mentioned, the Turn the Ship Around. Let's start leading through intent versus leading by command and control, and let's change people to allow them to think for themselves. And the job of a manager is many faceted. It's not just directing people, it's helping them grow. So let's concentrate on that second part a little more than the first part and see what happens.
So it's possible. I suppose.
Possible is very different than it will happen.
So I think you're never going to just kind of make a change and we're going to do it this way and it's going to work. I think there are things you can do, act in the present, which might make a difference and start moving things, and eventually things might change. I don't think there's I'll do this and that's going to work. I think you can do your best, and hopefully you can start making a difference.
So changing away from people, changing sort of leading people, or leading work, but focusing on growing people, and then maybe creating a bubble. Anything else that you could suggest, like a third advice?
I like to try to manage, as I said in the presentation this morning, out and up. How do I change the rest of my organization to support the success of the people that work for me? Do I need to get other people to work differently to allow a bottleneck of my team to go away? And that, to me, is always the role of a good leader and manager, is to look outside their team for the things that need to change and make them change.
Sometimes we come across practices that work in a given environment, but fly against the accepted wisdom of Agile systems. Like, for example, at Menlo Innovations, instead of having stable teams, they have intensive pairing. They switch pairs every week, and which allows them to scale up and down very rapidly in project, which is not the case for teams most of the time because of the human connections. Do you know any similar examples of surprising practice you've seen in organizations that kind of shouldn't work, but they found a way to make them work?
I have some acoustic problems. Kind of, similar kind of ideas in the at management level that sort of shouldn't work, but they've made some other changes possibly that sort of made their practice still work.
I can't think of anything specific to management, but I guess my first thought about that is when you go back to the roots of Agile, Agile shouldn't have worked, but it did. And then what happened was somebody said, oh, this thing works here, I'm going to write it down and we'll call it Scrum. And somebody else said, we know who it was Kent Beck, said, this thing works here, I'll write it down and we'll call it Extreme Programming. And those things now become the things that we talk about. Actually, I was reading recently, I think when Scrum was formed, Waterfall was 25 years old. Scrum is now 23 years old, I think. So we're kind of getting to that point in which what's going to replace Scrum. But people try things, stuff works, we write them down, they get copied. It's kind of the recurring pattern. Spotify has happened. You get ideas from, potentially Amazon, Netflix, two pizza teams. For me, it's about let's not get too obsessed with copying what's worked, and let's actively try and do different things to see what works. Because if we just copy things, it might work, it might not work. But who knows what's going to work and what's not going to work? So let's try and run experiments. And I think that applies to management as well. I suppose some things like your kind of holacracy and some of those no management things, they shouldn't work. They seem to have worked in some contexts. Maybe time will tell whether they have worked or not, because you kind of read different things about holacracy.
I think one of the things that I've used successfully several times, again, it's not management, it's just team-oriented, is that many teams can't succeed in a 2-week sprint. And so their natural response is, we need a 3-week sprint. And as we all know, that'll make the problem 50% worse. And what seems to work better is to cut them back to a 1-week sprint. Learn how to fix your problems more quickly, and you can be more successful. And once you start doing that and getting into that mode, maybe you can't successfully complete a 1-week sprint, but now you're able to complete 2-week sprints. And so going from 2 weeks to 1 week because we were having trouble seems the wrong direction, but seems to have the right result a lot of the time.
Yeah, it happens a lot that things when they start, but let's maybe start with the bigger sprint. Say, no, let's start with the short that you can give. No? And actually, on that point, I only introduced 3 weeks sprint in the very exceptional cases. Like, for example, we had 8 teams working together in that scale, a small scale Scrum set up. We distributed over 2 countries where the planning was a bit complex. I said, okay, in this case, we could go for 3 weeks. Otherwise, I always try to keep it short.
Another management technique that actually works is also for a team that's not growing is sometimes to deliberately cause some sort of conflict. Get the team pressing the edges against each other so that they grow in their thought process a little bit can sometimes be very useful. You have to do it in the right way, obviously, but there's forming, storming, norming. Well, if they stay down in forming, somehow you have to get them into storming. And so sometimes you have to create the conflicts that get them there so that they can grow beyond that, which seems counterproductive, right? Why would I want to introduce chaos and conflict, and yet teams grow through that?
Now, something that traditional managers have to do is employee performance reviews. And how do agile organizations do things like career growth and people supposedly need a feeling of progress or something that, as direction how to grow in a given context. How would an agile organization possibly do? What have you seen?
I think it's Jürgen Appello who says that one of the things he has seen that people hate most, and that is both employee and managers, is this employee evaluation. So I think that's something that nobody likes, but everyone does. Some sort of legacy in most of the companies, like if you don't do that, what do? You have to do something, And if you have bonuses tied, then even worse, you do have to do them, otherwise there are no bonuses. So there's some sort of a situation with these running cycles. And I've seen try different things. I mean, for sure, this 1-year feedback period is not very agile. So know after 1 year, what happened to the last year, what are you going to do next year? And most of the time, the goals you were setting broke down after 6 months because everything changed. So I had personally, as an employee experience, one of the managers I had, and I must say I enjoyed as an employee, excellent managers. I was very lucky with my managers. And introduced this one-to-one, which is given in the literature in some places. So every 2 weeks, we had a half-an-hour coffee planned in the calendar together, where we just pitch around about something, or maybe we had a serious conversation, or maybe we just talk about something which was not work, but we were planning this very regular feedback, so there were no surprises on this yearly evaluation. We couldn't take it away, so we had to do it, but at least we tried to build some agility on. So I was very happy about this solution.
If the meetings are on the same day, that's a lot of coffee for the manager.
Well, every 2 weeks, half an hour. Sometimes we had lunch. And he did it with all the people in his group, and I thought it was a very brave, it was not formal, it was not serious. But surely these yearly evaluations are a big problem everyone is taking an eye on. And I found Ericsson a couple of years ago did something terrific. I mean, you have to consider we're talking about 150,000 employees. I mean, quite a few ones. And there was an email from headquarters to the whole company saying, guys, we want to improve the personal evaluation system. We want feedback from all of you. And they created some sessions where you could join online, and so they tried to do some small groups, several ones, and anybody who wanted joined online and gave some feedback and gave some impression, and I talk about Jürgen Appello approach, and they said, oh, thank you, Almudena, very interesting, we write down. So they really consulted the company, so we don't like the employee evaluation, what do you suggest? And I thought it was a terrific approach.
There are many tools to do performance appraisals. The company that makes the most commonly used tool is SAP. An interesting statistic, they make the most widely used performance appraisal software in the world, and they have stopped doing performance appraisals internally. The feeling is, and this is common in the HR industry, common knowledge, performance appraisals actually reduce performance if they're done on a yearly basis. It should be constant feedback, just like you said, with 2 weeks. So I think the world has to change a little bit around that, and we have to help people understand how they're doing on a more regular basis. And we also have to measure the things that are important and not the things that only seem important. For example, a developer that writes a lot of code, is that a good employee or not? I don't know. It depends on whether that code was any good, on whether that code was valuable, on whether the customer liked what got created. On the other hand, if I measure people on some things that make a difference, like how much of the team's success was due to different individuals, how much growth did each individual help me achieve, how satisfied are our customers? Those are kinds of questions that we can answer on a pretty regular basis and have a clearer view of, are we meeting our mission of satisfying our clients and ourselves at the same time?
So you go back to, well, why do we do performance reviews? It's because we want to improve performance. And in order to improve performance, we need to get better. So I generally kind of go back to the lean community again here, because I think the first is the lean idea of going to the Gemba, so actually going and seeing where the work is taking place, so you can understand what the performance problems are as a manager, because you can't just talk to people and judge people. Again, you're managing the system, so you need to understand how well the system is working. So go to wherever the work is happening, see the work happening, talk to the workers, talk to the people, and find out what their pain points are, what's working, what's not working, and then we can start trying to figure out what problems we need to solve. So performance improvement is really about solving problems. So then we can start using A3s again as a tool, and A3 isn't just kind of a piece of paper. The A3 is more about a conversation, typically between a manager and their employee, or the mentor and the mentee, and it's about training people how to solve problems. So you want to teach people how to learn how to solve their own problems. And that's, if we're assuming that managers have more skills and more experience, then they want to transfer those skills of how to solve problems to the people. So A3s are a way of doing that. And when you get down to the fine level, there's a notion called Toyota Kata. So if Jesper's in the role, he's the expert on this. Go find him and hunt him down and talk to him. But you're really then doing that on a daily or a weekly basis of what things have we tried, what did we learn, what outcomes we're trying to achieve, what's working and what's not working. And it's getting down to a really disciplined approach to learning. So that's my preferred way of approaching it.
When we look at a lot of transformation or discussion about transformation, there is a message for people in the line. The teams, there's usually no problem. There's a reducing problem getting the CEOs and C-level people sort of getting the thinking that Agile is a great thing. Now, how would you engage the middle manager? Because usually the message is tailored to up or down, but what about the middle? What would be a good message?
I start working with those people and find out what outcomes they're wanting. What does success look like for them? What's their intent? What do they want to achieve? And then we can start looking at what the current situation is and what things we need to change in order to meet that intent. And part of that then is kind of looking up and saying, part of their intent will be meeting their manager's intent. So if you're going to start in the middle, what does success look like? What are the obstacles to success? How can we start removing those obstacles?
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the groups which is more hidden by these Agile transformations. So there are mostly the ones who ask in the courses, where's my position here? No? Because I guess the CEO is always going to be there, and employees will have a lot of work for them, and it is the middle management who gets, when going into an Agile organization, they get for the first a bit lost in space. And there it really depends on the people itself. You have some of them who embrace agility right away and they look for the position, and other ones who are more reluctant. You know, I've always been a manager, so what am I doing here? So it really depends a lot on the attitude of them. I'm completely convinced there's place for everybody, but those are the ones who really have to reinvent themselves. No? And I've seen the complete variety. I've seen people leaving the company when agility was introduced, and I've seen people embracing it and doing great things. No? So it really depends much on, it's not what we do for them, but what do they do themselves. Like, guys, where do you see yourself? And some of them were the ones who came up and said, what can we do for you? I think it was the right attitude.
I like to start with what they're worried about and what their pain points are and say, let's have a conversation around that. How will that change if we use an Agile approach? Many times the answer I get is, I'm overworked. That's painful. Okay, what are the things you're doing today? What are things that the team would normally do now? If we freed up that part of you where you said, let's give the team a vision and enable them to be successful, how much of your life would you get back? And that's just a starting point for how do we go further, how do we continuously improve, how do we do other things along that trajectory to help that manager recognize that they're an integral part of the system, and if they help in the creation and management of that system, while also respecting the workers in that system and allowing them to be successful, that's a win-win for everyone.
There was a question from the audience, something about scope of control or span of control. So, you know, we might not need nearly as many managers in an Agile organization. So, you know, do you have any rule of thumb, like, you know, how many people in the teams could work under single managers? Like, how much less do we need managers in an organization?
How much less we need managers?
Yeah, like, you know, we don't probably need quite as many layers and you know. So what do you think about that? Like, how many people, how many managers do you need for 100 people?
Personally, I always say, I got the question a couple of times, and I always say, as many as needed, no more, but no less. So, I mean,
sounds like a very consultant answer.
Yeah, but I mean, like when you have a company, let's take a flying company, let's say Air Serbia. Could you fly with Air Serbia, not with Air Italia, because have more managers than the other one? So having managers is not an aspect of quality, it's an aspect whether you need it or not. So having a lot of managers doesn't make you a better company. So how many do you really need? And that is, of course, always an interesting question. And then you look at the hierarchies. If you have 8 levels to get to the CEO, okay, with 150,000 people, maybe can handle it. With, let's say, could we maybe make 7 out of it? You know, can we go down one step? What happens? And depending on the size of the organization itself, that's huge already. No? If you reduce 1 hierarchy step and you are down to 7 instead of 8, it sounds to us as Agilists still a joke, but that's already a huge amount. So it's not as much as the numbers, but the hierarchy levels, things plays a role. And then by the daily work, I always say, as many as needed, please no more. It's a consultant answer.
I think the related question, though, is how would you know whether you've got too many managers, or how would you know whether you've got too few answers? So that's a way of figuring that out. So, and maybe you can let's start with 0 managers. So what bad things might happen because you've got no managers? What would happen if you had 1 manager, 2 managers? And so part of it is experimenting, and let's maybe start simple and add managers until we kind of figure, actually, that seems to be working quite well. That you kind of touched on another point, though, which I'm not sure whether it's related or not, but the idea of the management hierarchy as being also a communication path, where for this person to talk to this person, you've got to go all the way up to the organisation, back down again. So, and that's usually kind of a reason to get rid of management. But just because you have these management hierarchies in place, it doesn't mean that these people can't talk to each other directly. So kind of relates a bit to silos. So silos are not necessarily bad things on their own. They're bad things when they stop communication. So we can still have silos within our organization, or these kind of non-cross-functional areas in the organization, as long as people are still talking to each other across those things. So maybe you've got too many managers when it's breaking down and stopping communication. That might be kind of an indicator of too many managers. Those are the things I might be kind of looking for.
I don't know that you need managers, but you need their skill. You need somebody doing that work. One of our clients, Geonetric, which I mentioned in our talk earlier, is their organizational structure is very flat. They did not go with holacracy because holacracy has actually gotten very complicated over the years. They just said, let's form scrum teams. And they have 10 or 15 scrum teams that each have sales and marketing and engineering and all the support services they need. Each of those teams has a profit and loss that they're responsible for, and they run as little versions of the bigger company, which allows them to not have managers. They act internally as their own managers. So you can go that route. You can also go the route that says, and I would never go larger than what Scrum recommends, 3 to 9 people as a maximum reporting to someone seems like a logical thing. The Dunbar number would say something similar. The ideal team size, which I don't know how they come up with this team size, but it's 5.5 people. I don't know do you have a kid working with you? I'm not quite sure. So I would try to stick to some of those numbers as a starting point if I was going to have managers in the organization without distributing that role across multiple people.
As a final question, it might be slightly off topic, it shouldn't be much. In a lot of organizations, the managers work with HR department on things like salaries and hiring, firing, career path, stuff like that. So do you have any advice for HR departments regarding how to operate an Agile organization to support the Agile managers and people in the organizations?
I couldn't hear the question.
So do you have any advice for HR organizing
HR.
people, HR, human relationships, or human resources? God forbid.
So if we take a very negative view of HR, it's about compliance and people following the rules and kind of that kind of really boring administrative stuff. Where I've seen it work well is it's more about developing the people and understanding, do the people have the right environment? What training or what skills do we need to help people with? And those sorts of things. And ultimately, it's how do we support our people in order to help support the customer? So there's some kind of changing the relationship between HR and the rest of the organization from being a compliance-based one to be an enabling one.
As soon as I join a company for consultancy, I just make sure as soon as possible we get HR on the boat. And there are companies where I arrive and I meet an HR employee the second day. It's right there, so who wants to be involved in the Agile transformation. And there are others where you have to ask for them. No? So when am I meeting somebody from HR? So there you notice also some huge difference from one company to another, what the attitude is. But generally, I try to get them on the boat from the Agile transformation as soon as possible, giving some small tasks to do to support me as a consultant, asking them for advice explicitly, saying, hey, you are HR here in this company, maybe you can tell me how I should go this direction. So I really try to get them close and give them responsibility on the Agile transformation. So with me, they always join very reluctant, curious, they don't know their position, because it's true, it's not defined. And I always welcome with a big hug. Oh, happy, great that you're here. I was looking for you. And you are the right person, you're going to help me. Could you do this for me? Do you think we should do this? And then they feel more confident, they feel part of it,
I think it's also important for HR to understand how to hire people that will thrive in an Agile environment. Creative problem solvers, people who think differently and can think in loops, versus the person who wants to just be told what to do and follow directions. So I think as we transition to a more and more agile organization, HR has to help managers understand the hiring process can't just be 10 people asking them questions. It has to be how do we see them in action, actually solving problems in their thinking process, so we can evaluate whether that's a cultural fit with our company, a cultural fit with the team, and also a cultural fit with agility in general.
They almost become part of the team themselves. I mean, you're probably not going to have literally an HR person as part of the team, but they're part of that system. And so I did talk to there is an HR community out there, an Agile HR community out there, and there's some meetups in the UK. And I talked to one lady from one of the UK banks, and yeah, she had the teams that she worked with, and she would spend time with those teams, and she understood Agile, and she wanted to understand how she could help the team, what sort of skills and people that team needed from a hiring perspective.
Exactly.
So yeah, it was it was a very human relationship.
Thank you. It's been really delightful having this conversation. Thanks to the audience for the questions and being here with us today. So, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.